Welcome everyone to our third series in Wine 101. Today we're going to talk about what I think is one of the most romantic beverages ever created. We're going to talk about port, or what we can't call port here in the United States now. We'll talk about that a little bit too. This we want to try to keep to 20 minutes or less. I could go on for probably 90 minutes about port and the history of port. So maybe we'll continue in a later series if anyone is really interested. So port number one, we can't call it port in the United States if we were not selling it under the brand port with the name port prior to 2005. So in 2005, the EU signed an agreement with the United States that basically dictated that any of the beverages or products that had a name associated with a location, like Champagne or Chablis or Chianti or port, could not be replicated outside of those areas. So in fact, with the TTB here in the United States, you can't call the port after 2005 anything that has those 3 to 4 letters. So you can't call it porf, you can't call it pork, you can't call it, you get the point. So we're relegated to calling it a dessert wine, or just a red wine. So you could say it's a red wine that has high alcohol, or you could say it's a dessert wine. Both are misleading. And in the great wisdom of our government, we have a fortified winemaking license. That's what it says on our permit. We're a fortified winery. It's a special permit to make fortified wine or port, but we're not allowed to call it fortified wine because the government says fortified means it has vitamins and minerals, which is contradictory to our license. So unfortunately, there's nothing close like Champagne. You know right off the bat, it's a sparkling wine, so calling a wine sparkling wine, you say, wow, it's like Champagne. You can't do that with port. So dessert wine might not be fortified with brandy, which is where the fortification comes from, and I'll talk about that here shortly. But that's really the nuance around why some of us can call it port and some of us can't. So if you were selling it retail prior to 2005 under the name port, you were grandfathered in. Like JOLO, our first vintage wasn't until 2013, so we're stuck with either calling our port style wine either dessert wine, which it's not, or red wine, which it's not. So that's one of the reasons that we have to really, I think, educate the consumer on how port is made and how it varies greatly from a regular dessert wine. Most dessert wines are either hung on the vines a little bit longer, so they have higher sugar, and they leave some of that sugar in what's called residual sugar in the winemaking process. So you don't get a high alcohol wine. So to be a port, it has to be a minimum of 18% alcohol and no more than 24% alcohol. So after that, it becomes almost a distilled beverage category. So most ports you will find will be around 18.5 to 20, typically, on the back of the bottle. So port, where did it get its name? So from Portugal, or in the old series in Portugal, the old time in Portugal, it was called Oporto. So port is from not Port or Porto, Portugal, but the Douro Valley, about 100 kilometers northeast of Porto. So Porto is where the wineries are, and the manufacturing of port takes place in Oporto, Portugal. So what they do is they harvest the grapes in the Douro Valley, and they bring them down 100 kilometers down to Oporto, and there the winemakers process the grapes to make port. So you're probably curious how it got its start. Great question. So English are very popular for serving port almost at every meal, and it's something they toast the Queen with. They don't use champagne, they use port to toast the Queen. So it's been a long tradition. In fact, England and Portugal has the longest uninterrupted alliance in the history of the world. So they've been friends and allies, and England and France have always been fighting back and forth, and with trade and other things. So that's one of the reasons English aren't really big on French wines until maybe the 19th, 20th century. So they really basically had a great alliance with Portugal. And what they would do is they would take all the red wine or the white wine and from Portugal and import that versus importing wine from France, because they were always in fights with France. So what they found was on that journey on the river or the ocean going up to England from Portugal, that the wine spoiled. So to keep it from spoiling, they added brandy. So they added alcohol to increase the alcohol level, which makes an inhospitable environment for bacteria and spoilage mechanisms. So that's how that happened. So in the early stages, they've been making it for about 2,000 years. Wine in Portugal and putting extra brandy in to help with the exporting and have it still be a drinkable wine. It wasn't until the 19th century, about 1850-ish and change, where they started leaving residual sugar, because all the old port was dry, and just high alcohol. There was no sweetness to it. So again, it wasn't until really the 19th century where they decided to do what's called fortifying the winemaking by arresting the fermentation process. So the way it works, the way you make port, after you harvest the grapes, you will take the grapes in and you'll start fermenting the grapes. You've crushed the grapes, they're fermenting. In Portugal, they use these big stone, what's called lagers, which are probably around the size of half of a swimming pool and about 2 feet deep. And that's where they dump all the grapes, and they crush the grapes by feet most of the time. You'll see big parties, and they'll invite people in just to get the grapes somewhat crushed, and then they leave it alone, and the yeast kind of go through the process. And then when the alcohol level gets to about 7, because it starts off at 0, so you take all these beautiful, luscious, ripe grapes, and they have what's called brix, which is the sugar level in the grapes, which is a level of ripeness. And for every brix, they get converted by the yeast. The yeast eat the sugar in the grapes and convert the sugar to alcohol. So for every 1 brix, you'll get about 0.59 alcohol. So if you had 10 brix in the grape to start, you'd end up with a finished product of about 5.9 alcohol. So let's say you start at 22, 23, 24 brix. So you're measuring how low the brix went with your a little mechanism called a hydrometer, and you'll test the brix, and when it's around equaling about 7% alcohol, you'll add brandy. So the brandy that we keep is in a French oak barrel here in the winery, and we'll take it out of that French oak barrel and we will have it into the tank waiting. Then we take the berries that are fermenting, we put them into the press, we press the fermenting grapes that are still fermenting. They still have residual sugar, so the yeast has not been able to eat all of the sugar to convert it to a completely dry wine. So it's a semi-sweet or a sweet wine, and now we're gonna press it. So we have the tank super ice cold, around 0 degrees, which is also very inhospitable for active yeast. It makes them very sluggish and sleepy, and makes them want to go to sleep, and then ultimately it'll kill them. And so the tank's super cold, and then we have the brandy in there, which is waiting for slowly for the yeast and the berries that come in. So we press the grapes in the press, and the juice gets pumped into the tank, which is ice cold, and which also has the brandy. So now as the yeast are coming in, they're slowly dying in that very inhospitable environment of alcohol. So slowly, and they'll have a carryover, because our grapes are especially so delicious, they cling on to the last little itty bitty bite. I want one more before I go. And then what happens is they ultimately go. So you might I start usually at 10 left on the alcohol, or 10 brix, 10 or 11 brix, and I'll finish at probably 8 brix. So, because you'll have what's called a carryover. And so the sweetness in the port that you drink, or the dessert wine here in the United States that you drink that's like port, all the sweetness is just the pure grape juice left over from the fermentation process. By arresting the fermentation process and stopping it short by adding the alcohol and the cold, you're left with a partly wine. The sweetness is all from the grape juice, and then you have the beautiful alcohol and rich aromatics of that brandy that's been aging in French oak right prior to fortifying and blending the two together. So this, like I said, has been going on for 2,000 years, and to me, I've said it before, our pickup parties with the wine club members, I'm really not so much a winemaker as I am a historian. And I say I'm a historian because every year I get to create a time capsule. So this port that we made in 2013 is a vintage port. So we'll talk about that in a minute, because there's different types of ports. So it's a very complicated category, but we're going to simplify it. So In this vintage port of 2014, this is a time capsule. This is my backyard, Yadkin Valley. This is Cynthiana, the same grape I used to make Palate Fog. This is everything that grape and me as the winemaker and our area went through in 2014. So you can imagine here in 2020, with what's going on in the world, there's going to be a little history to be told in all the wines that we make in 2020. Because while the entire world is shut down, we're out pruning vines, and getting it ready for the new buds and the new growth and the new blossoming of this year's vintage. So here is 2014 in a bottle. The weather, the climates, what we went through, and that's what's really, really pretty about vintage products. So, and not many other products in the world have a vintage on it. So you don't get vintage lettuce, you don't get vintage beer, you don't get vintage scotch. So wine is history in a bottle. It is that year in a time capsule. That's part of the romance. So you have in port, you have white port, you have red port, and then you have a bifurcation of red port I'll talk about in a second, and there's a new category called rosé port. I haven't found one that I like yet. So we'll see how that goes. So it's kind of an interesting situation because white port, you start off with white grapes, goes through the same exact process, and you put it into a barrel. And it goes in almost clear or just a little bit golden, kind of like a white wine or a Pinot Grigio, as you can imagine. But the brandy actually makes it a little bit lighter, so it gets lighter than that. But as it ages over 20 or 30 years in a barrel, it gets darker. So it gets to be like a dark, dark, dark brown, almost like a hue of red. And the red port starts off as, we talked about the bifurcation. So the red port, you have a ruby port and a tawny port. And the ruby port means it's ruby. It's ruby in color, like this, or Muddy Paws. It's got a ruby color to it. And typically, they're aged for about 3 to 5 years in a barrel. 3 to 5 years. And then they're bottled as a ruby port. So vintage ports are ruby ports. So this is a vintage port. Here I pulled out of my personal cellar a 2000 Taylor Fladgate, which is was rated 100 points by Wine Enthusiast and Wine Spectator. It was, I think, number 2 or number 3 wine of the year that year in 2000. So I was able to score this bottle back then for like 86 bucks. It's now worth about 300. So here is a nice little investment. So wine does appreciate. I've never seen a beer go up in value or a 12-year-old scotch go up in value. So it's one of the few items that you can drink that also appreciates in value. So it can be an investment as well as an enjoyment factor. So you have the ruby port and then you have the tawny port. So the vintage ports are ruby ports, and then the vintage port means that every grape, or at least 95% of the grapes in that bottle, this one here, 95% of the grapes in this bottle were harvested in the year 2000. If it's not a vintage port, it's a combination of vintages. And most, like we do at JOLO for the Muddy Paws now, use what's called the Solera method, which I'll talk about in a moment. So these two here were prior vintages. Our 13 and our 14 Muddy Paws were vintage ports, which means they were made from grapes growing that year and that year alone. So when you have the vintage port, you can usually, you'll release it about 3 or 4 years after aging in a barrel. Then you have what's called late vintage bottlings of port. So a late vintage bottling means they not only age it for 3 or 4 years in a barrel, maybe 5 years in a barrel, then they'll keep it and hold it 2 years in the cellar before they release it. So that's where you may see it was a late vintage of port, or a late barrel vintage. So those are the two vintage ports, which are ruby ports, and then you have ruby port, which is not vintage. They make it in usually what's called the Solera method, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that's the ruby port category. Then you have what's called a tawny port. So you can see ruby gets its name from the color. It's ruby in color. It's dark, dark red, not yet garnet, but more ruby in color. And then the tawny port relates to the basic color of the port. It's a tawny color. So this ruby ports are going to have much more deep, dark red fruit aromatics. They're going to be youthful and lively and still have that nice presence of oak around the edges of the wine, and also add some nuances and depth and character, maybe some coconut or dill or vanilla, especially in using French oak or American oak. You might get a little bit of dill and butterscotch and coconut. So with a French oak, you're going to get more spice and vanilla and maybe some leather and tobacco. So the tawny port gets oxidized. So as we've talked about prior, air is the enemy of wine, but port's not wine. It's fortified. It's basically like an amaretto or a limoncello. It's 40 ABV, 40 proof. So if it's 20 alcohol by volume on the back of the bottle, it's times 2 or doubled. That's your proof. So it's basically 40 proof, which I think like Frangelico and Amaretto, those don't go bad. You can leave those. In fact, you could open a bottle of Muddy Paws and keep it on your keep it in your refrigerator for 3 or 4 months with a cork in it, and it'll taste almost identical. So port doesn't do a tremendous amount of aging. Older ports don't do a tremendous amount of aging in the bottle because they've already been aged and oxidized in the barrels. So for example, you have a tawny port. A tawny port, you'll see them usually listed as a 10-year tawny, a 20-year tawny, a 30-year tawny, and even a 40-year-old tawny. So the 40-year-old tawny, for example, has wine in that bottle from 40 to 49 years old. So you say, how do they do that? Which is very expensive. See these barrels here, the Solera method, and Solera means on the ground in Spanish. So on the lower level here would be the oldest vintage, let's say 40 years. The next one on top might be 39 years old. The next one on top, 38 years old. And every year, you take a little bit out of every single barrel. So you'd have a 40-year chronology of barrels, each with potentially vintage port in each barrel, but now they're combining those vintages. So they're taking 49, 48 years of vintages from every barrel, blending it together into one bottle of tawny port. Let's say a 10-year-old tawny would have between 10 and 19 years worth of port in that barrel. So you don't retop them off. So in wine, we always talk about the angel share, and you lose 10% a year because of the evaporation or the wicking through the barrels. With the ports, you don't top them off. So you end up with that headspace of air, which we've talked about before. You all know now it's called the ullage. So that ullage, that airspace, is creating oxidation. So it's turning the wine a brownish color or a tawny color. So with a tawny port, you can end up with much more, less fruit and more earth and nuttiness, caramel, butterscotch, almonds, hazelnuts. So you get a much more light brown in color, and you'll get more of the nuttiness. So a lot of people have an issue or a problem. What do I pair this port with? I don't know what to drink with it. So they sit and maybe have a cigar with it, which is fine, but you don't get a lot of the nuances by having a cigar. There's 2 things that I love to have a nice, beautiful ruby port with. Not a tawny port, a ruby port. So like a Muddy Paws, for example, or a vintage port. So 2 classic pairings in all of the world is a nice blue cheese. So a Roquefort cheese, a Stilton cheese, a really rindy blue cheese, and have that because they complement each other. It is not to be believed, the combination. It's like peanut butter and jelly. They are meant to go together like champagne and caviar. So that is a classic pairing. My classic pairing, barbecue. So if you want to be blown away, and you want to blow your guests away, have a sip of your favorite barbecued pork with, I don't know, pick your favorite barbecue sauce. It's high vinegar, ketchup, it's got sugar in it. So it's got the yin, it's got the yang of the vinegar and the sugar, and then the umami effect of the ketchup that's in there. Maybe there's a little mustard. Maybe they put a little extra spice in there sometimes. So every red wine that I've ever tried with barbecue chicken, barbecue pork, brisket, you name it, it just falls flat and gets lost. The barbecue overpowers it, and you really get nothing. If you want pure balance and elegance with your barbecue, you want to have a nice port. You have the high heat of the alcohol, you get the sweetness to cut through any of the spiciness and the vinegariness. You get the high alcohol, you get some nice acid to help cleanse the palate for the next bite. It's got tannins from sitting in the barrels, so it has tannins to help with the cleansing of the palate between the proteins of the chicken and the beef and the pork. It is a match made in heaven. So if you want to blow your friends away this summer with a barbecue, pour a glass of port. They'll be like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. So definitely give that a try. So to me, beyond that whole history, the other great tradition, which I just absolutely love, because wine is about tradition, and I'm not, you know how I am. I'm a winemaker, not a beer maker for a reason. So I'm not a big beer maker fan, yeah? So I think it's a very fast process, not a lot of tradition. It's not steeped in tradition. Like I said, they've been making wine since 6000 BC in Georgia. Not Georgia here, Atlanta, Georgia, but Georgia by Armenia. It's north of Armenia and just a little east of Turkey. 6000 BC they've been making wine. They just started making beer like, I don't know, 400 years ago. So it is the most, in fact, rumor has it, when Noah got off the ark, the very first thing he did was plant a grapevine. So it is steeped in tradition. It's part of lore. It's part of whether it's the Bible or the origins of modern humanity, it's there. So you might not know this gentleman, but he's the Bishop of Norwich. You ever heard of him? No. All right. So an English fellow, and he had this tradition where you would never pour your own port. So it's in a decanter. You would pour the person to your right's port in their glass, like this. You're welcome. And you'd hand the decanter to the gentleman or lady next to you to your left, and they would pour to the person on the right, which would now be me. It goes all the way around the table until everyone has their glass poured. So you never, ever, ever pour your own glass of port. Where else do you get that? I mean, it's a tradition since 1805. And it's kind of funny. So he lived until 93 years old, which was probably double what the life expectancy should have been back in 1850, or I think he passed away in 1898 or something like that. So if you do that process and somehow you get caught up in conversation or you forget to pour the person on your right, the person who you didn't pour should look at you and say, sir, do you know the Bishop of Norwich by chance? Because he was renowned in his later years for falling asleep during the dinner and forgetting to pour the person next to him because he was 93 years old. So because he forgot to pour the people next to him, if you do that, they say, by chance, do you know the Bishop of Norwich? Because you forgot to pour my port. So I think that's just a remarkable way to end the story of port. Like I said, there's so many ins and outs and nuances, and just the Douro Valley and the type of varietals they grow and the type of other wines they make. There's just so many different aspects to port, and the different, the rubies and the white port, which I didn't really get into much. So it's just a very enjoyable drink on its own. And be careful. That's why we put them in small little bottles, by the way, because they're high alcohol. So this half bottle has almost as much alcohol as a full bottle of regular wine, especially a white wine. Lastly, and we'll go enjoy a glass. You'll notice that, especially at JOLO, I put wax on most of our bottles. So there's a slow micro-oxygenation that happens with the corks. You get about 1 milligram of oxygen into the wine in the first 6 months after bottling. And then after that, you get about equal amount every 60 months. So, and after about 25 years, the corks themselves will degrade and they lose what's called elasticity. So that's why you'll see special processes to open a bottle of port, like the vintage port that's super old, because the cork will degrade and you don't want a lot of those little itty bitty bitty chips in your wine. So they actually have what's called port tongs where you'll heat them up in a fire and they clamp around the neck of the bottle, and then you pour cold water over that after it's super hot, and then you'll rub it with like a shaving brush, and then when it cools off, you'll just take the top of the bottle and the glass will be cut perfectly and the cork will be inside this part of the neck. So we use the wax to help reduce that oxygenation. As slow as it is and low as it is, this still helps the atmospheric oxygen, especially if you're keeping it on the side, from helping to wick out some of the wine, because you'll actually lose some of the content of the wine and get some air exchange in here. So we put this wax top on, so it is a pure time capsule and should be able to last for hundreds of years. So hope you all enjoyed the day of port. Cheers.